All right. So in this video, we're finally going to finish putting Germany together. And in here, we're going to talk about the Franco-Prussian War. So this is another big pivot point in European history, the Franco-Prussian War. This is what's going to give us a finally unified Germany. All right, so in the last video, we created the Northern German Confederation. Which is really just Prussia and a suit of armor made of little Germanys. So we finally got Prussia and Austria in a war that had been building for probably the last 50 years. And Prussia pretty much destroys Austria in that war. And Prussia creates this Northern German Confederation. The only German pieces left outside of the Northern German Confederation were Austria, and that was by design, and the Catholic little Germanies in the south. So if you go back to like the 30 Years' War, these were the parts of the Holy Roman Empire that remained Catholic and fought against the Lutheran parts of the Holy Roman Empire. So these pieces were Catholic for a long, long time. And so what Bismarck has to do now Bismarck has to convince the Catholic little Germanys that Prussia is their best protector, not Catholic France. He also has to convince the other great powers that France is the bigger threat to peace than Prussia. So this is a big task to undertake. So Bismarck has to wait and bide his time until that right opportunity presents itself. And the opportunity to do this to do these two things finally happens in 1870. Because really what we want to do is, again, have France attack Prussia, and Prussia gets to play the victim. just like they did with Austria. So here's what happens. The King of Spain died or abdicated, it doesn't really matter. But there was a line in the there was a vacancy on the throne. It doesn't really matter how it happened. Now that I think about it, I think that the king abdicated, but it doesn't matter. All that matters is that there was a vacancy. And a Prussian prince was in consideration for the throne. Now, Napoleon does a sensible thing. Napoleon asked the King of Prussia, Wilhelm, to remove this prince because he didn't want to be surrounded by Prussians. And to be fair to Napoleon III, that was a sensible ask. This was done through the French ambassador to Prussia. And so the French ambassador asked Wilhelm on behalf of Napoleon. And then this transcript was sent to Bismarck. And this is known as the Bod-Ems transcript. Bod-Ems was the name of the place where this happened. So that's why it's called that, the Bod-Ems. So the Bod-Ems transcript. So the transcript was sent to Bismarck, who edited the transcript slightly to make Wilhelm look like he insulted the French ambassador and then sent it on to Napoleon. And Napoleon's ego got the better of him. And Napoleon declares war on Prussia. So this is the start of the war. So when the war starts, Napoleon honestly believed that everyone would be on his side. Like generally speaking, what about the balance of power? right? Is nobody noticing that Prussia is basically taking over all of Central Europe? Nobody seems to care about that. But there are a number of individual reasons why Napoleon thought that people would join his side. But nobody wanted to. He bet wrong on every one of these alliances. Russia was now an ally of Prussia. Italy might have helped. But they were mad about all those French soldiers in Rome that were still there protecting the Pope. Austria was in no condition to help, and they really didn't want to after they just got their butts kicked by Prussia 2.5 years before this. So the only people that might have helped were the British. Because the British are really, really interested in maintaining the balance of power, but remember, Bismarck kept that proposal made by Napoleon III to divide up Belgium. And that made the British pretty much say, you got yourself into this, Napoleon, you can get yourself out of it. So it looked like no one was going to help Napoleon, and you'd think that that would be enough to get him to pull back and not really go forward with the war. But Napoleon III went forward anyway. Because he needed something to distract the French from all the bad foreign policy decisions he had been making. Like what happened in Mexico. So he figured that a quick war against the Prussians would get everybody back on his side, and he could stay in power. But the war was a disaster for the French pretty much from the beginning. The Franco-Prussian War starts in July 1870, and it was a disaster for the French right from the beginning. Just to give you one example of how poorly the French were prepared for this war, the Prussians mobilized really fast. And the reason that they were able to do this is because they used double rail lines when they made railroads. basically, they set up two roads that were parallel to each other so they could send trains out with troops on them and send back empty trains and just cycle troops where they needed to go. So they always built these parallel rail lines. The French, on the other hand, only built single rail. So there was only one line. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to send troops out and then turn the train around and send the same train back empty, which doubled the time it took to move troops. And on top of that, Prussian industrialization focused on military stuff, and French industrialization didn't. So when it came to guns and other weapons, the Prussians were built to produce those things. And the French produced those things too, but it wasn't the entire focus of French industrialization. The Prussians were building everything to be a military power. And the French were a military power, but that wasn't their sole focus. Suffice it to say, the war did not last super long. In September of 1870, Napoleon III personally led an army into battle, and all of them, including Napoleon, were captured. So 104,000 soldiers. And that was pretty much the end of the war. So on January the 1st, 1871, Wilhelm and Bismarck proclaimed the German Empire at the Palace of Versailles. All the remaining little Germanys were annexed by this new German empire. And Wilhelm is no longer the king of Prussia. He is named Kaiser of the Germans. And so at this point, Bismarck's big plan to protect Prussia through nationalism and war, or put another way, blood and iron, is now finished. He did it. He's now finished his plan, and Prussia is now as safe as it could be. One other point we need to make about this is that, unlike Austria, Bismarck needed to humiliate the French to show the Germans that France was not an option. And that is going to come back at the end of World War I. Because France is going to want to humiliate Germany right back. And so to set that up, I want to do a quick little epilogue to all of this before we talk about the German Empire after unification, which will be our last video on this series. So this is a weird little epilogue, and we're going to spend this epilogue, and we're going to spend this in Paris. So, at the end of the war, or right before the end of the war, Paris was put under siege by the Prussians for 4 months. So from September 1870 to January of 1871. And when they surrendered, France had to pay a huge debt to Prussia. And this was part of the whole humiliation thing. They also had to give Prussia 2 territories which are going to be important for World War I and World War II, Alsace and Lorraine. They also had to disarm the French army. But whether this was a accidental oversight or a purposeful oversight, I don't know. But the National Guard in Paris, remember them from 1830 and 1848, the National Guard was allowed to keep their guns, which was a mistake that Charles X had made, and it looks as if maybe Bismarck had made the same mistake. So new elections were held in France. Because Napoleon III had been kicked out, so we have a new republic. And this new republic was set up in the city of Tours, not Paris. And that's important. This government in Tours was pretty conservative. Paris, however, sets up a rival government that was extremely socialist and backed by the National Guard, who still had guns. So, Tours, the government in Tours does not have guns. The government in Paris, however, does. And this new Paris government, which dubs itself the Paris Commune, revives the French Revolutionary stuff. Including the calendar and all the feminist ideas. All of the most radical ideas of the French Revolution are now coming back with the Paris Commune. The Tours government sets up at Versailles, which is just outside of Paris, and they ask Bismarck if they could have their guns back to squash the Commune in Paris. And Bismarck agrees because he doesn't like socialists any more than the guys in Tours do. And that was pretty much it. The army storms their own capital and executes all the leaders of the commune. And we get a more or less liberal-ish republic until we get up to World War I, and we'll worry about that when we get up to World War I. One last side note about this is that a few of the commune leaders survived because they weren't in Paris at the time that the army came in. So they were elsewhere in France trying to gather support for what they were doing in Paris. And one of these commune leaders that survived, his name is Georges Clemenceau. And Georges Clemenceau is going to be the prime minister of France during and after World War I. And he's going to be the one that wants revenge on the Germans. And so when we get to time period 4 and we get to the Paris Peace Conference that ends World War I, it's Clemenceau's need for revenge, not only to protect French honor after what the Germans did at Versailles, but also because the Germans killed a bunch of his friends who were running the Paris Commune. He really wants to get revenge on the Germans. And that's what's going to drive his interests at the Paris Peace Conference. And it's a deal breaker. And you can kind of see why it's a deal breaker. He really, really hates the Germans. But we'll worry about all of that stuff when we get there. And in our last video on German unification, we're going to talk about what this new German empire looks like now that Bismarck has successfully put it together. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.